The third of the seven churches of Asia Minor that Jesus addresses in Revelation chapters 2 and 3 is the church in Pergamum in 2:12 through 17. Pergamum had long been prosperous. It had taken the lead in helping Rome defeat the other kings of the Eastern Mediterranean. So naturally, they were in good with Rome, and that stood them in good stead in terms of business relations and so forth. So again, a messenger would go from Patmos to Ephesus, north to Smyrna, and north to Pergamum, next of all. And here you see it more closely. Now, some of these cities in Asia Minor actually were originally Greek cities. Smyrna and Ephesus certainly were that. And we actually, because of the excavations that have gone on in Pergamum for a long time, you can see reconstructions of what it would have been like, or it's thought that it would have been like. And here are some more, again, thanks to Todd Boland for these photos, BiblePlaces.com. Here's the Acropolis Theater at Pergamum. Your local library is probably in better condition than the Acropolis Library at Pergamum, but the books are pretty old. I actually can't see the books here, but here's the Asclepium Theater at Pergamum. And Jesus says that he has the right. Their faithful witness, his faithful witness Antipas, had been martyred there. And so they may have thought, okay, the government has the right. Roman government actually held the jus gladius, the right of the sword, and reserved that for itself. Only provincial governors were allowed to do that, or kings under Roman auspices. But Jesus, not the Roman government, has the right to execute here. And here he encourages the persecuted, but also the way he speaks of the sword, he says he's going to make war against the prophets. Sword was regularly an image of war in the Old Testament. Now, the prophets here that he's making war against are the false prophets, in this case, the Balaamites. He speaks of Satan's throne in Pergamum. There are various suggestions as to what this means. One is the famous healing cult of Asclepius there, which was symbolized by a serpent. You still have that on the medical emblem, going back to the Greek god of healing, Asclepius. There were pagan connections in Pergamum also with a lot of other deities, Demeter, Dionysus, Athena, Orpheus, and I'll show a few of those temples. But first, let's look at some of those of Asclepius. You can see ruins here of the sacred way leading to the Pergamum Asclepium for the worship of Asclepius, who was a hero, a demigod that came to be worshipped as a god. More of the sacred passageway at the Asclepium, and more of the subterranean chambers there. And here are remains of the temple of Asclepius at Pergamum. Obviously, these are just remains. And a coin from Pergamum depicting Asclepius and his staff from somewhere around this period. Again, the staff is similar to what you see on some medical emblems, which are not meant to evoke Asclepius, but meant to evoke healing. But you also see the serpent there. Temple facade and the statue of Athena from Pergamum. And here are remains of the temple of Dionysus and more of the temple of Dionysus. Here's the temple of Serapis. This is from the early 2nd century, so a bit later than our period. But the temple of Serapis, Serapis was an Egyptian deity, kind of put together a couple, when they put them together, it talked about Serapion, but anyway, Serapis was associated with Isis, an Egyptian deity, but some of these cults had spread throughout the Mediterranean, including the cult of Isis and Serapis. Here's another picture of it. As you can see, it was kind of large. Others suggest that this is more like, and this is probably a stronger suggestion than the Asclepius association. The throne-like altar of Zeus the Savior. This is not going to be what I think is the likeliest suggestion. But anyway, the throne-like altar of Zeus the Savior. It was a colonnaded court shaped like a horseshoe, 120 feet by 112 feet, so pretty big. Its podium was nearly 18 feet high. That's just the podium. And it was decorated with serpent sculptures. Again, serpent will play a big role in Revelation 12 and a few other places. So here are foundations of the great altar of Zeus on the Pergamum Acropolis. Obviously, it looked better back then, or worse, depending on your, well, theologically, we might say worse, but here's a reconstruction of it. You can see these are stairs going up to it. It was massive. Here is a life-size reconstruction in, I think it's in Germany, no? Well, it says it's, okay. I guess maybe it's in Pergamum. And a bronze medal with the Pergamum altar. So Zeus was pretty big deal in the Greco-Roman world. I mean, Zeus was considered the chief deity of the Greek pantheon, equated with Jupiter by Romans. As Paul says in Romans 1, people made gods in their own image. God made us in his image, but people tried to return the favor, and it didn't go very well. The gravest threat, though, was the imperial cult. So this again is later than the time that John writes. John probably writes in the reign of Domitian. This is temple honoring Trajan, who was after Domitian. But this was another one of the temples in the Acropolis, and the worship of the emperor could be a big deal because you didn't want to be accused of disloyalty to the emperor. It may not have been the cause of persecution, but it's possible. The old temple of Augustus stood on the lofty rock citadel visible from afar. He was the first emperor of the emergent Roman Empire after the death of the Republic. He was the emperor actually when Jesus was born. This is over this is about a century after that time. But spiritually, the seat of Satan could be expressed in all these ways. It was a place of spiritual evil, Satan's throne. Now, some people were claiming to be prophets, were saying, hey, this is okay. You can avoid persecution, you can avoid conflict, you can avoid people thinking badly of you by just going with the flow of where society is going. Now, we want to be nice to everybody, so I'm not endorsing people being mean in the name of Christ at all. But at the same time, that doesn't mean we just always go with the flow of everything, because there's some things we can't do. We can't bow to idols. And in this context, the issue was eating food offered to idols and sexual immorality, which may have been associated with cultic prostitution probably wasn't so much a thing in this period, although they may have been ordained isn't the right word, but prostitutes may have been associated with Aphrodite. That was their patron deity anyway. But Balaam in this passage is the prophet saying, you can go ahead, you can do these things. God won't mind. Well, Balaam is probably not the name his parents gave him in this passage. Same with Jezebel in chapter 2, verse 20. You've got 2:14 Balaam and 2:20 Jezebel. Probably not the names their parents gave them. These are Old Testament names for people who did bad things in the Old Testament. Balaam was a false prophet. I mean, he was a true prophet in the sense he heard from God. He's a false prophet in the sense he disobeyed God and tried to bring judgment on Israel by trying to get them to sin. So here's somebody who, again, is risking bringing judgment on the church by getting them to sin. What did it mean for him to be like Balaam? Probably meant that his donkey was smarter than he was. But anyway, what did this nickname mean? In the Old Testament, Balaam was greedy, and Jewish tradition amplified that all the more. The only way to remove God's favor from Israel was to get them to sin. So he specialized in two sins: sexual immorality and food offered to idols, and tried to get Israel to do those things. These remain the typical temptations of paganism. You see that in 1 Corinthians 10, for example. Now, this passage may be referring to physical sexual immorality, or may be referring to spiritual unfaithfulness to God. In the Old Testament prophets, sometimes it's used one way, sometimes it's used the other. If it's used here spiritually, even in that case, it's based on God's disdain for physical sexual immorality. So when you have people saying, we feel like the Spirit is leading us today to be more progressive, and it's all right to commit these sins, that's in the realm of false prophecy. These things are not allowed. Here is an ancient, half a millennium earlier, bowl that shows the offering of a sacrifice to a deity. Here's a bedroom in a brothel at Pompeii. Hopefully they laid something softer down on top of that bed. But anyway, I guess they figured it beat being on the floor. And here you see young men soliciting prostitutes. And if you've got this on your dining ware, you know that's a big deal in the culture. Here's another one. Syncretism is what missiologists call it when you mix elements of one religion with elements of another religion. That's not to say that everything in every religion is bad. Certainly not everything in every culture is bad. But people sometimes mix things from one that don't belong in another that are really bad for the other. So North Americans, sometimes when they're thinking of syncretism, they think of, some Asian Christians commit ancestor veneration. Now, in the lightest forms, it's just respect, but sometimes it actually involves like food offered to, eating food offered to those ancestors to whom things are sacrificed or whatever. In Latin America, we have what Louis Lesbatek, a Catholic missiologist, called Christopaganism, where you have a mixture of veneration of saints with pre-Christian deities. They accepted certain things, but just as an overlay. And so in some parts of Latin America, there are some people who do that. And the use of shamanic healers in Africa. Now, this is different from using traditional medicines or herbs, but the people who actually invoke spirits to help them with traditional healing. And yeah, that can be syncretistic if you have Christians dealing in the wrong kinds of spirits, not the Holy Spirit. What about syncretism in North American Christianity? Sometimes it's easier to spot the splinter in somebody else's eye than the log in our own. Are compromises with secular values any less threatening than with other pagan worldviews? And when I say secular values, I'm not talking about getting along with everybody in the culture. I'm talking about anti-religion, not just tolerance of everybody. The term gets used in different ways, so I just wanted to clarify that. But is monotheism one God or less? Is atheistic anti-supernaturalism an acceptable presupposition in seminary Bible courses? Is religion merely a private matter to be kept to oneself and segregated to Sunday mornings? Now, if you're going to be nasty about religion, please do keep it to yourself. But I mean, our faith in Christ ought to shine through our lives as we're nice to people, as we love people and engage people where they're at. and help people. But anyway, is our skepticism of miracles when we pray related to deism? We got some hangovers from some pagan elements in our cultures too. And then the less talked about ones, maybe you've got obvious areas of compromise, people using horoscopes, psychic hotlines, and so on. But then you've got the ones that most North American Christians don't take seriously, that may have originated with some pagan things and aren't really used that way today, but like the tooth fairy, Easter bunny, divinatory practices like throwing the garter at weddings, reading fortune cookies, which I guess is imported, or seeing which way the groundhog looks to try to predict the weather. I mean, it's kind of a joke with us today. Now, personally, I don't look at the fortunes and the fortune cookies, but I do eat the cookie. But anyway, here's another one. And I mention these other ones because sometimes, with certain other cultures, we'll say, wait, isn't that pagan? When it's actually something that is like when I was visiting Congo with my wife, who's from Congo, and um, we were getting a shirt for me from there, and the designs on it, it was like, are these pagan gods? She had me look more closely and said, they're elephants. Wow. So sometimes we see things as pagan when they're not. I mean, elephants are God's creation. But anyway, uh, but let's get to a real one. Jesus said you can't worship both God and mammon. There are a lot of people who try to do that today. Are we tempted to say, how could ancient Christians be so foolish to be tempted to eat food offered to idols or something like that? Their excuses might be better than ours. Meat sold in the marketplace had often been offered to pagan deities, more consistently meat doled out at festivals and temples. So in the marketplace, you might not know whether it had been offered or not. But if you're eating in a restaurant attached to a temple, you can figure it probably was offered to a deity. Festivals were the only times most people had access to very much meat other than fish, but one could share meat in the temples. Meat might be left over from the imperial cult, other sacrifices. But persecution isn't mentioned in Thyatira, so maybe it's more subtle, because they also have the same temptation as Pergamum. Your brother invites you to his wedding. Are you going to come? The reception is at the temple of Aphrodite. Are you going to come to the reception? Are you going to eat at the reception? Are you going to diss your brother? Do you understand? These were real life issues, the kind of things we grapple with today. And the prophet is clearing things out for them. No compromise with paganism. There may also be an economic temptation here, a challenging economic likelihood in terms of participation in trade guilds. So again, this is not as serious as at Thyatira, where trade guilds were really, really, really big thing. But trade guilds, if you were a member of a trade and you wanted to be respected by fellow members of the trade, and you wanted to participate in the same supply lines and so on, and lobby for common interests with the civic government, well, the trade guild normally had a monthly meeting. And at this monthly meeting, they would have a meal. And the meal would be dedicated to the patron deity. They pour a libation in honor of the patron deity. Can you do that as a Christian? Can you participate? And if you don't participate, is it going to look like you're dissing them? You say, well, my religion doesn't allow me to do this. Wait, so you don't honor our patron deity? Yeah, you can see the kind of complications that come up. Standing faithful to Jesus. Now, maybe some people would have said, oh, well, I respect you for your religious conviction. But other people are like, hey, you're against our religion. Why can't you tolerate us? Why can't you eat with us? So it's going to look kind of rough, but we're not supposed to compromise with values that dishonor our God. We have to show lives that honor God. So Antipas had been killed among them because he was a believer. Withstanding persecution was part of what they would have to do to overcome, but especially they had to resist the prophets of compromise and worldliness. Now, they're given a promise. Like in Ephesus, the promise is to eat from the tree of life. Well, this one's going to be about eating also. In Laodicea, there's going to be a promise, I'll come in and dine with you, even in the short term, as well as eternally. But here, part of the promise is you're going to receive hidden manna. Well, why is the manna said to be hidden? According to the Old Testament, manna was originally deposited in the ark. Manna was this bread from heaven that God gave his people in the wilderness so they wouldn't starve. Well, some of that was deposited in the ark. It didn't last there too long, we find out later, but it would be restored when the ark would be restored in the end time. Well, according to Jeremiah 3:16, the real ark was never going to be restored. But Jewish tradition after that said, yeah, the ark and temple vessels are just hidden, and they'll be restored when the Messiah comes. One tradition says that Jeremiah hid them. Another said that the dying high priest threw the temple's keys to God in heaven, threw them up, and I guess God caught him. He has to throw pretty high. But anyway, for Revelation, it speaks of a heavenly ark being revealed in 11:19. And for Revelation, this manna probably also is, you get a foretaste of it in the new Exodus, where God's people in the wilderness are being fed by God in Revelation 12, around verse 5. And also we see this image for the world to come, eternal sustenance without labor. 7:17, the Lamb who's in the midst of the throne will lead them and guide them to springs of living water. And again, Revelation 22, where we will be able to eat from the tree of life. Some people say, oh, I'm not going to get to eat in heaven. No, you'll get to eat plenty. May not be, may not be literal with literal teeth grinding and literal belly digesting and needing to take literal tums because you ate too much of it afterwards. But anyway, it'll be good. Notice the bread that God promises, the manna that he promises. Don't deal with the idol food. But if you abstain from the idol food, you'll get the true food from God that matters way more. He also says you'll get a white stone. Now, this one, I'll give you some different opinions. In my Revelation commentary, my Nyback Revelation commentary, I had more of an opinion than I do now because I'm less sure now. Anyway, but the white stone would symbolize something. Often such a tessera or small block of stone or ivory would contain inscribed words or symbols. This may be a contrast with Asiatic paganism. The sacred totem of Cybele or Kubile, they would say, was a black stone. Perhaps more likely, some have argued that these are admission tokens because people used pebbles as admission tokens for some public assemblies or festivities. So this could be your admission token to the Messianic banquet where you get the manna from God, the banquet in Revelation 19. Well, the good banquet, marriage supper of the Lamb versus the great supper of God where the vultures are coming and eating corpses. I say possibly likelier. I think in the commentary, I thought it was definitely likelier. But anyway, court image. In some courtrooms, jurors voted for acquittal with the white stone and conviction with the black stone. And in a capital case like that of Antipas, Well, Jesus was going to overturn the verdict of the Pergamum Christians' persecutors at the final judgment when he declares both life and the second death. Why white? Well, that would fit for acquittal, but I think more importantly, and here we're on more solid ground because we've got plenty other stuff about it in the book of Revelation, maybe also to symbolize life or purity, because you know, clothed in white garments in chapter 3, chapter 4 in heaven, chapter 6, the martyrs, chapter 7, you've also got white garments. So the white makes sense. And it's associated with day and night, not with complexion, by the way. If anybody thinks like this is like pro white, it's anti-black. It has nothing to do with complexion. It has to do with night and day. That's where the imagery comes from originally. But another reason that it's white may just be practical. I mean, Pergamum mostly used dark granite, but they used white marble for inscriptions because I guess it could show up better. Here's an example of an inscription at Pergamum on a white stone from the Roman period. You also get a new name. So we'll get a new name, presumably inscribed on this white stone, maybe an admission ticket or something else. But anyway, we'll get a new name. Pagan deities sometimes gave worshippers new names to signify a new identity. I'm not sure how common that was, so I'm not sure how relevant that is. But the idea of getting a new name, I mean, where did we get our name? Most of us, our parents gave it to us, maybe our adopted parents who were adopted really young. Most of us, or sometimes it's a nickname somebody else gave us. But anyway, usually it's our parents. It's somebody in authority over us who's going to be looking out for us. God gave Israel a new name in the Old Testament, a name associated with promise. And some other people he also gave new names to. Probably what we have is the hidden name of God and of the Lamb, which will bear forever. Those are going to be written on us. Elsewhere in Revelation 3:12 will be like a pillar in the temple of God. He'll put his name on us. The name of the Lamb is on the 144,000 in 14:1. And yeah, we could keep giving examples, and we'll give more examples as Revelation goes forward. Where do we draw the line? Where do we draw the line between paganism, compromise with what is against God, and being nice and relating to the world and seeking to persuade people about how they too can have this wonderful, precious gift that God paid for everybody to have, wants them to have. So we want to speak to them in a winsome way. Well, Joseph and Daniel respected their pagan colleagues. They, Pharaoh's court, the Babylonian king's court, they weren't just working with fellow believers all the time. Paul uses Stoic language, Stoic philosophic language. He hangs out with the Asiarchs, many of whom would have been involved as priests in the imperial cult. Jeremiah says to the exiles in Babylon, seek the good of the land. Jesus eats with tax collectors and sinners. The Pharisees were really upset about that because you're not supposed to hang out with sinners. Psalm 1:1, Proverbs 13. But what that meant was avoid being influenced by them. It's different if they're welcoming, if they don't mind you talking about Jesus, there's no reason you can't hang out with them, just so long as you're not absorbing the wrong values. So don't compromise with idolatry. As 1 Corinthians 10, I think it's 31, 33, somewhere around there, do everything, whether you eat or drink or anything else, do everything you do for God's glory. Context there is don't eat the food offered to idols, whatever, especially if people know that it was offered to idols, and it makes them think, okay, well, this isn't a big thing, your God versus those gods. No, there's only one God. and we respect you guys. We respect you for being religious, but we have a different kind of hope that we want to share with you. And we're happy to be with you, but we can't do something for your God. Do it for you, but not for your God, because we only acknowledge one. Anyway, theological compromise with today's culture. Relativism invites accommodation. Relativism isn't the same thing as tolerance. Tolerance is you put up with people, actually bearing with one another. In Colossians and Ephesians and so on, he's telling us to do that with one another in the church. But in terms of outside the church, he says, who am I to judge those outside? I'm talking about those inside, 1 Corinthians chapter 5. So we don't have to go around being a busybody in everybody's business and saying, hey, you shouldn't be doing that. You should be praying over here. We tolerate people. We tolerate not just different religious views. We even tolerate somebody using a Mac if we're using a Dell, or vice versa. Or we tolerate whether the person puts too much salt on the food or whatever. We tolerance is a good thing. Tolerance helps me; it makes me tolerant. Now, but relativism is a bad thing. Relativism doesn't mean hanging out with relatives. That's a good thing. But relativism means nothing is actually very true. Nothing is actually true enough. Nothing is truer than anything else. And we don't normally say that in some disciplines. I remember J.P. Moreland once saying, if somebody hands you a glass and you think it's orange juice, but it's actually it's a beaker of nitric acid, or was it sulfuric acid, or aqua regia? Anyway, it's going to make a difference whose view is correct, like life and death difference. So, yeah, relativism means it doesn't really matter which is true, or this isn't really truer than something else. People like to treat religion that way. It's purely subjective. But God has given us plenty of objective reason to believe in Jesus. I say this as a former atheist who was converted to Christianity by Christ. And so some people are like, everything's relative. That's absolutizing relativism. So if I say, I don't think everything's relative, they'll say, you're wrong, because they think the one absolute is relativism. Now, if they're really genuinely relativist, they may say, okay, so you think I'm wrong. That's cool. Maybe you're right that I'm wrong. But most people don't do that. Anyway, absolutized relativism is philosophically inconsistent. It doesn't actually respect the distinctives of any of the exclusivist religions, such as Orthodox Christianity or Islam or Judaism. Polytheism can always accommodate more gods. That's what they had in the first century. And sometimes the way to be not tolerated was to be intolerant toward all their gods. And they're like, hey, we tolerate all these gods. We can tolerate your God, but you don't tolerate our gods. We can't tolerate you. So we've faced temptations a long time to compromise, but we're not supposed to do that. Revelation promises a better world to come to everybody who comes over to follow Jesus. And it makes it easier for us to avoid compromising with the present one, because we know we have a better promise for the future. Those who wish to inhabit the New Jerusalem have to come out of the present Babylon. Babylon is portrayed in Revelation as a prostitute. The New Jerusalem is portrayed as a bride. Prostitute, temporary gratification. Bride, we're going to be with Jesus forever. The prostitute, the temporary gratification, has nothing on the permanence of our union with Christ. We live for that union, not for union with the world. We're here, we live in the world, but we bring to the world a different set of values, a value that should be expressed most of all in love and in tolerance and in a lot of other ways. But we show them a hope we have that they can have too in Jesus Christ.